And they look a bit gloomy at that, but that's more or less accurate, because conditions like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, early onset Alzheimer's, all these things which are diseases of later life, certainly have many of them have a strong genetic component, although quite what that means is rather more subtle than perhaps what they think at the beginning of lecture 1. But then I say, if you're feeling gloomy about that, cheer up, because if I'd been giving this lecture in Shakespeare's time, 2 out of 3 of you would be dead already, okay? And these are the chances of staying alive for a baby born in England in 1601. About 1 in 3 made it to 21. In 1801, just before Darwin, about 1 in 2, a bit more. And in 2001, effectively 99%, which is roughly where we are now. Okay. So it's been an enormous shift in patterns of mortality. In Shakespeare's time, even in Darwin's time, what killed you were things that came from outside, or seen mainly to come from outside. Cholera, starvation, cold, violence, air pollution in the Victorian era. Now we die because of the enemy within, which is our own inborn weaknesses, our own human imperfections, our own stains of perhaps original sin. Now that's perhaps why genetics has become so very, very important. But the notion that we can explore our own fate through biology goes back indeed to the Old Testament, but in its modern guise was invented by this chap here, Francis Galton, who was, as many of you will know, Charles Darwin's cousin. And he left us, as Peter Lindsay did, he left us a substantial sum of money, University College London, equivalent to about £11 million today, to found what became the Galton Laboratory, which was the first laboratory of human genetics in the world. And Galton was a remarkable man. He was extraordinarily clever. He did a number of very strange things. He's the only man, he was very much concerned with human quality, the inheritance of human quality and the measurement of human quality. He's the only man, as far as we know, to have made a beauty map of the British Isles, and we still have the little brass counting device he used to hold in the palm of his hand and walk through the streets of British cities, scoring the local females on a 5-point scale from attractive to repulsive. You'll be glad to know the high point was in South Kensington, where, of course, it still is. The low point was in Aberdeen, and there has not been much change there either. Okay. But that sounds absurd, but it isn't absurd because you can do it, and we've done it with students, and it's people, women to men and men to women, it's quite consistent. If you can measure it, you can do science on it. But that was part of a much larger agenda, which is to ask about the inheritance of human quality, okay? And Galton's book is called Hereditary Genius, and that's what he wanted to know. He was strongly of the opinion, with really rather little data, that people of genius, like himself, had fewer children than people not of genius, like the ordinary man in the street who was having too many children. And Galton, as you can see, was a pretty stark-looking character there. This is a quote, but he also did a number of genuinely important things in biology. This is the first regression line ever drawn. And what Galton did was to measure the height of parents and offspring, large numbers of them, and simply to draw a graph, and this is it, showing the patterns of similarity of parents and offspring for height. And he, in fact, invented the word regression, with a slight, which is a statistical term, of course. It slightly changed its meaning since then, but he certainly used regression analysis to measure the inheritance of things like height, weight, intelligence, all these kinds of things. So he was a major player. However, he was perhaps a little too confident in the powers of his own abilities. As it is easy to obtain by selection a breed of dogs or horses gifted with the powers of running, we could get a gifted race of men by judicious marriages. As we can breed horses for points, so we can breed men for points. And he was strongly of the belief that eugenics, being well-born, Eugene, was the way to go. You should give money to people who had, high quality to have lots of children, and persuade people of low quality not to have any children at all. And that philosophy led to, as we all know, completely disastrous results. And to some extent, but not by any means, to every extent, has been abandoned. I mean, when you listen to people talking about chavs, that's eugenics. They're plebs, they've got too many children. Galton was right, okay? Now, Darwin was a most extraordinary man, and I could go on for hours about Darwin, and I won't. But Darwin was a great guy for quotes. Actually, it's a bit like the Old Testament. There are too many quotes in the Old Testament. And here's my favourite quote from Darwin. "Ignorance more frequently breeds confidence than does knowledge." And I think that should be tattooed on the forearm of every undergraduate. Okay, if you don't know anything, then you can be completely confident about what you're saying. And Galton is a classic of that, because in retrospect, he knew nothing whatsoever about genetics, nothing. Yet he was utterly confident, people followed him, terrible political consequences happened as a result. And even in more recent times, that's happened with genetics. I mean, I remember, it must be 30 years ago, speaking at a schools conference, where Robert Winston and I often speak at these conferences, and mentioning the disease cystic fibrosis, which of course I'm sure you all know is a very severe disease which can be treated, but is definitely life-threatening. And at the end of one of these conferences, a young lady, must have been 16, came up to me, and she said, "I've got cystic fibrosis." And I thought, oh dear. And then she said, "But I'm not worried, because my biology teacher tells me that it can be cured by gene therapy." And that's just complete nonsense, just babbling nonsense, particularly 20 years ago. So again, there was this problem of overconfidence. And that's what I want to explore, is this question that we can actually disentangle people's fates through science, particularly through the science of genetics. It's around, I think, less among biologists than among the general public. But here's a sample of hits, of quotes from Google. Just type in "scientists find the gene for." Well, you get 38,000 hits, which is quite a lot of hits, given that we've only got 23,000 genes. And there are repeats, of course, and some of them are real, but some of them are pretty odd. Emotional memory, fear, depression, sweet tooth, weight gain, premature ejaculation. I'm not sure how that one stays in the population, but we've got a gene for it. Okay. And you can find this again and again and again. But what does that mean? There's a great phrase from Shakespeare, also a man who used too many quotations, about "on thy foul nature, nurture will never stick." And that's from The Tempest. That's on Prospero's Island, where the little devil Caliban lives, and the shipwrecked sailors try to be nice to Caliban, and he refuses to respond. And in great exasperation, one of them says to Caliban, "Thy foul nature, nurture will never stick." That's the beginning of the nature-nurture word. The idea there's a dichotomy between nature, the way you're born, and nurture, the environment you experience. And you can separate them out. It's like a cake, which you can slice into a bit of gene and a bit of environment. And that drives this argument of science finds the gene for. But that simply isn't true. Okay? It's not true in many different levels, some of which are trivial, perhaps, but show how the system works. Here's a familiar mutation. Okay? It's a genetic error in a cat. And I have a great interest in cat genetics. I make biologists' jokes, which some people will recognize. I talk about porphyria and phenylketonuria. These are bad jokes, still. And there's lots of good cat genetics. Darwin himself noticed that all white, blue-eyed cats are deaf. And now we know why that is. But this is a cat mutation, which is pretty popular. People breed Siamese, and we all know about Siamese. They've got black nose, ears, tail. And if they're a gentleman cat, which this one is, although I think it's rather a shy one, black testicles as well, and a white body mass. And you can do crosses, like geneticists do. You can track down where this gene is, and we know exactly where the gene is. We know what it does. It sort of interrupts the production line, to use an engineering term, which makes the black pigment melanin. So it's a fault in that production line. So it's genetic, no question of that. You can, over the generations, breed from relatively dark and relatively light cats to get slightly different appearance, and Siamese cat fanciers do that. But crucially, it's also environmental. Nature and nurture are working together. Because what's happened is that the step in the production line which has been damaged, has only been slightly damaged. So that in relatively low energy environments, the relatively cold parts of the cat's body, here's its nose and its tail, and of course its testicles, which are both literally and metaphorically the coolest part of any male mammal's body, where it's cold, the thing can work. It makes black pigment. Where it's warm, the main body mass, which is 2 or 3 degrees Celsius warmer than that, it can't, so you have this odd pattern. And if you want to make a dark Siamese cat, you can breed from dark ones, or you can keep your cat in a cold room, and you will end up with a dark Siamese cat. If you want to get a very expensive black cat, keep it in a refrigerator. and it'll, in a time, will be black, and you have a Siamese cat struggling to get out, but it can't show it. If you want a white Siamese cat, keep it in a warm room, exactly the same gene, but interacting with the environment. There's a famous cat whose name was Edward, whose owners shaved its initial E on its side and kept it growing, and that's perfectly natural black fur with the initial E, which stalked the streets of London, striking terror into the local feline population. So, in fact, the central point about genetics is the gene and environment cannot be separated. They always work together. Okay? And that really is what we're beginning to realize we don't understand. That the more you understand about genes, the more important the environment seems. And that is something which is certainly not percolated into public discourse. There's a statistic which I won't talk about in any detail, which is called heritability. And you often see that a particular attribute has a heritability of 0.8, say, which is 80% of the total variation in the population is due to genetic variation. And you can measure it in many ways. Look at parent-offspring similarities, look at adoptions, look at identical twins. It's kind of an industry looking at heritability. It's a ratio of genetic variation to total variation. So it's a ratio of genetic variation to gene and environment considered together. So you can change heritability by changing either the gene or the environment, and that's central. Okay. So what does that do how are we getting on in finding the genes behind this heritability? Well, one of the things we don't know about genetics, and it's a real embarrassment, is that we don't know the genes behind most attributes which are highly heritable. Galton found, and he was dead right, that human height is about 0.8 heritable. 80% of the total variation in human height within a population is due to genetic variation from family studies. How many genes have we found? Well, the last time I looked, which is about a week ago, we'd found 110 different genes influencing the normal range of human height, and altogether they explained less than 5% of the total heritability. So there may be thousands of genes, each with a tiny effect there. So the idea of a gene for being tall or a gene for being short is extremely foolish. And that's true for many attributes. I've coined the term macavity genes. Okay, macavity, the mystery cat. The evidence that he's there is easy to find. You know, you've got a strangled pug on the stairs, shall we say, but macavity's not there, and the genes aren't there. And that's universally true also for things much more important than human height. Things like, here we go, this is a paper in Nature, the case of the missing heritability. Where's it gone? We don't know. Okay, that's height, but things like schizophrenia too, which is really a very grievous illness, which has a high heritability in family studies. What we've got here at the bottom of the human chromosomes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, and the little blobs are different places where different authors claim to have found the genes behind the individual variation in schizophrenia. This is kind of this is an old slide. 2004 is the most recent paper. That's prehistory in genetics, I can tell you for sure. But in fact, in 2013, every one of those blobs has disappeared. They were all imaginary blobs. So we don't know any of the genes behind tendency towards schizophrenia. So that's one thing we don't know. But the fact that we don't know the details of genes behind heritability doesn't alter the fact that heritability is a useful and widely used measure. It's used in animal breeding, for example. It's used in many other fields as well. So forgetting the fact that we don't know the genes involved, what can we say about heritability itself? Well, one of the this book of mine, The Serpent's Promise, has has biblical quotations at the top of every chapter, and one which I quote is from Ecclesiastes: "The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong." Okay. The race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Okay, and here we have a horse race, horses going racing. And then that goes on in the usual beautiful language, but time and chance happeneth to them all. Okay, so however good you are as a horse, because you're well trained or you've got good genes, the environment, which is somebody falling over and you falling over them, is going to impinge upon you. So you can't, nature and nurture are always going to work together in horse racing, and and as well as everything else. A huge amount of money has been spent, of course, on looking at the genetics of speed in horses. Many, many millions and millions and millions of pounds and dollars have been spent on this, simply because it's a huge industry. And if you can breed a super fast horse, you're going to make a lot of money. And there's a big equine genetics unit in Newmarket which does exactly this. And there's been some success, okay, without question. There's plenty of it. And it's worked, all right. What you find is that there is heritability of speed, how fast a horse can run. But it's different on on dry tracks and on wet tracks. On dry tracks, 40% of the variation is due to genetic variation, and on wet tracks, where they're liable to slip and fall over, only about 20% is. So the heritability depends on the environment, and that's pretty universal. And again, that's equally true in humans. Spot the athlete. This is Mo Farah. There's an athlete of superb quality with his identical twin brother. And Mo Farah came with his father from Somalia to Britain, went to a state school, was picked up as being an extraordinary athlete, and was trained to the limits of his ability, whereas his brother stayed at home, and he's now a car mechanic, okay? Although they used to race, and often the other one would win. So again, nature and nurture working together, all right? So that's kind of, that's the use of heritability in sport. Okay. Now, actually, what's remarkable is, unlike in many human attributes, we're beginning to find some of the genetic variation which is behind that particular talent in horses and many other creatures. And here's one of the genes which hinted as to what was going on. This is a Belgian. This is a bit like the Findus pies scandal here. This isn't, in fact, a horse. I'll let you into this. It's actually a cow. So if you wanted to buy horse meat, you might be accidentally buying this. This is what's called a Belgian blue, and a Belgian blue is a mutated beef cow or bull, which carries an error in a protein that's called myostatin. And myostatin is a protein which controls the rate at which muscles grow. Okay, it actually stops muscles overgrowing. Okay, so in fact, this creature has got a very poor, it's been an error in the myostatin protein, and so it doubles up its protein mass. Okay, and you can see it has this rather embarrassing appearance, but it's rather interesting to farmers because it's producing huge amounts of meat. Okay, well that's a cow, but what about its effects on sport? It turns out we have the same thing in racing dogs. There is a thing called a bully whippet, which has exactly the same mutation, which doubles up the muscle side. Now, what happens is, when these dogs are born, in the whippeting world, when they race them around tracks, they kill them, okay? But in order to show the effect, you have to have 2 copies of the gene. And you can't see the effect if you've only got 1. But if you look at the DNA of the winners in the whippeting world, a high proportion of them have got a single copy of this damaged gene. And the whippeters don't know what to do about it. They're talking about banning them, but they're not sure. But whippets don't bring in much money, but horses do. And it turns out that we have exactly a related system in horses, where the genes alter the ability of the animal to quite a striking extent. In horses, it's not the case that we have an error that destroys this protein myostatin and you get this bizarre, super-muscled individual. But we do have variation in the strength, as it were, the concentration, as it were, of the protein itself. And what we can do is to look into the pedigree of horses and see where it comes from. And we can also go to the bones of horses now extinct, many of which have been preserved in museums and the like, and take the DNA out. And it turned out that a 1-letter change of a letter C for a letter T in the DNA in a mare, probably about 150 years ago, brought this in from into the horse thoroughbred line. All other horses and zebras have got the letter T. Then we have T goes to C. And this is Nearctic, which is a famous racer of the 1950s, who had literally hundreds of offspring and spread this gene throughout. And it turns out that if you've got 2 copies of the letter T, you're much better at winning in long-distance races. If you've got 2 copies of the letter C, you're much better at winning in short-distance races, and if you're intermediate, you're half and half. And there's a company in Dublin, appropriately enough, called Equinome, which will now do your horse for you. And this, of course, is a big, big worry, because now all you need is a punter to go craping around the stables the night before a race, pull out one hair from its tail, and there you've got the information. Is it a long-distance winner or a short-distance winner? And again, there's great concern about what to do with it. What they're doing now, they haven't quite yet started doing this on the basis of the genes, but in horse racing, if you're good, okay, you're penalised for it, because you have, in many races, handicaps. If you've done very well, either because of your biology or your jockey or your training, it's too bad. That spoils the fun. That means that you're likely to win again, and that makes it hard for the bookies to make their huge profits. So what they do is they handicap them. They have things called imposts, little lead weights, which you have to carry if you're naturally biologically talented. All right? So that's one semi-logical reason for one semi-logical way of dealing with inborn differences in a particular ability, a rather trivial one maybe, which is the ability to run fast if you happen to be a horse. Well, I too went through a genetic test of ability when I was a lad. I didn't actually realise it was a genetic test. I'm talking about 1955 here, some years ago, which is only 2 years after the discovery of the double helix. What was that test? Well, it came from the 1944 Education Act, which set up the 11-plus exam. And the 11-plus exam was a classic attempt to find children who nominally were naturally talented, but had not been found. Okay. Here's what the 11-plus exam was based on. This is fill in the gap. I won't ask you to do it, but many of you will have sat through this painful process. You've got top left square, top right square, bottom right square, and you're supposed to fill in the gap, okay? You fill in the gap. And I spent hours, as many of you did, I'm sure you'll remember, practicing these tests so we would get through the 11-plus exam. If you'd managed that, you had a question such as in each question below, find the two words that are different from the others. Compliment, mock, unwrap, ridicule, and taunt. And there are others. Another one, which I actually remember from mine, write an account of a conversation between an eagle and a sparrow. Okay? Okay, well, and the argument was that if you did well at this, you were suited not to be penalised, but to get a benefit by going to a grammar school, which, surprisingly enough, I managed to do in the 1950s on Liverpool's left bank, the Wirral Peninsula. I got through. Only about 10% of my primary school class got through. The other 90% did not. My brother did not, and he spent his life as a bricklayer as a result. And there were huge differences in people's fates. Of the people who failed the 11-plus, hundreds of thousands of kids in 1955, not more than 1 in 1,000 actually sat A-levels, and not a single one of them got into Oxford or Cambridge. Okay? So not much has in fact changed, really, when you think about it. Okay. So what that turns on is the assumption that there is genetic variation in IQ, which you can pick up with this rather silly test. All right. Well, is that true? There is genetic variation in IQ. There's genetic variation in everything. We don't know the genes behind it, the normal range, but we don't know the genes behind almost anything else in the normal range. But it's there. There's genetic variation in IQ. Some of you will have heard of that notorious book called The Bell Curve, which is an idiot book of the major proportions, which claims, because of the supposed difference between blacks and whites in the US, that blacks are less intelligent and hence deserve to have less money spent on them for education, which is exactly the 11-plus argument. So it's the opposite to the horse riding argument. Okay. The first hint that IQ is by no means as simple as you tend to think came from this famous Flynn effect, which was a slow increase in mean IQ over the years since IQ tests first started in the 1940s. It's now slowed down, but there has been a considerable increase in IQ, so that a typical modern young man transported to 1914, the outbreak of the First World War, would have an IQ of 30, IQ of 130, while an average soldier on the Western Front would have an IQ of 70. It's slowed down, really, in the last 10 years for a reason we don't understand. But there's been no genetic change in those years. There has been an environmental change which we don't understand. Better schools, without question, better nutrition, maybe all these video games actually make you better at doing those silly tests nobody really seems to know. They're huge. Exactly the same thing, of course, has happened to human height, which is increased in just the same way, even though that's also pretty heritable. So if you do heritability studies on IQ, it's actually rather interesting. Here we have the heritability of IQ in relation to age in American kids from adoptions. And in adoptions, what you do is children are adopted into families, okay, and the question is, do they stay in their height or their IQ or their personality like their biological parents, or do they begin to resemble the family into which they're adopted? In other words, is it the genes, is it the nature, or is it the nurture which is more important? And the result is really rather surprising and quite unexpected, which is that in children up to 11 plus age, there's effectively zero heritability of IQ. If you bring in a kid from a poor home into a generally middle-class home, which are generally the adoptive homes, the average increase in IQ is 12 points, which is quite a lot. So what happens is very quickly these kids converge on the intelligence scores of their adoptive parents' biological children. So if you're in a nice, happy, warm home with lots of books and television, your IQ goes up. However, when you get to be university age, 18 to 21, then maybe to an extent the biology begins to show a bit more of its presence. And by heritability goes up to about 0.4. And when you get to be 70, heritability from family studies goes up to about 0.7. And that turns out to be quite a common pattern in lots and lots of human attributes. That the heritability when you're small is low, and as you get older, it gets more and more. And in some ways that may be because as we get older, our environments get more homogeneous on the average, and hence the genes have more of a chance to show their effects. But the interesting thing is it's also the case that you can do it with family income. And the lowest 10% of families, and these are really poor families in the States, I mean catastrophically poor families in the States, the heritability of IQ of the children is 0.1, and in the top 10% of families in the United States for wealth, the heritability is 0.7. So again, if you live in a household which has no books, no poor food, absent father, violent background, all this kind of stuff, however good your genes might be, they haven't got a chance to express themselves, so heritability is very low. In a nice middle-class family, like mine was, with lots of books and that kind of stuff, then you get a better chance. So ironically, all the 11 plus did, and did it really rather effectively, was to pick out children from good homes. That's what it did. It did a really good job. It would have been just as easy to ask what the parents' income was, and would have been considerably quicker. And of course that still happens. We have an educational system based absolutely on picking up children from good homes with lots of money. As you probably know, in 2010, just 5 top British schools, 4 of them, Eton included, private, the other one, Cambridge Sixth Form College, those 5 schools sent as many pupils to Oxford and Cambridge as did 2,000 state schools combined. Now, it could be that the kids who go to Eton and the like actually are blessed with DNA of amazing symmetry and quality. Or maybe it's just a good school. And the answer is it's a good school. Their parents have money. Parents are willing to give allow their sons, as they perch on their pinstripe bottoms, to have an environment in which their genes can manifest themselves, and the sense that they deserve it because they've earned it. It's a fantasy, it's just not true. But the interesting thing is the contrast with horse racing, maybe. And this is, I really think, where genetics begins to run rather uncomfortably close to some of those old theological arguments about good and evil. In racing and in sport, and it's not just in horses, but in athletes as well. If you've got good genes, you're penalized for it quite often. Okay. In education, it's the opposite. If you have or are thought to have good genes, you get actually rather a benefit from it. So, which is really quite illogical when you think about it. So let's turn now to the. This is actually a very interesting paper, recent paper I just put in today. This is kind of a complex paper. Can you see this? When I was good at this kind of thing, I could work on the lights, but I can't. No. as usual, these things are always totally impenetrable. What can you see? Not much. Well, that's a map of the British Isles, okay. And on the right here, you can see where London is, that's where we are, and the warmer the colours, okay, in these little population samples, the warmer the colours in a London borough or a London suburb, the more extreme the income inequality, okay? So that London, of course, is an extremely unequal city, particularly with places like South Kensington in the middle of it, it's a huge income inequality. If you go to somewhere like South Wales, shall we say, or even Teesside, average incomes are lower, but also there's much less income inequality. So the environment is much more homogeneous in a place like Teesside than it is in London taken as a whole, where we have billionaires and we have people who have been chucked out of their flats because they can't pay the bedroom tax. Okay. So, and on the left, we've got the measures from the same places of the heritability of IQ, and they're an exact mirror image of the income inequality picture. So in a place with a lot of environmental noise, genetics is less important. Genetics is more important in a place. Genetics is less important in a place with lots of environmental noise. Okay. Now, let's go to one of Francis Galton's most notorious statements. It is easy to show that the criminal nature tends to be inherited. Now, Galton was a smart cookie, and the picture on the right of Galton there, that was one of his composite photographs, the first ones ever taken. And what he did was to get a whole pile of burglars and a whole pile of murderers and a whole pile of shoplifters and take pictures of them and print them on the same negative. Now, that's done with computer graphics now, but in his day he did it with a developing bath. And he had the honesty to say that he couldn't actually see much similarity between burglars versus murderers versus vicars. But that's what he did to try and do it. These were burglars. These are composite burglars. These guys. Okay, they do look a bit like burglars to me, but still. All right. So it's easy to show that the criminal nature tends to be inherited. Now everybody knows that's true, don't they? It's obviously true that the criminal nature tends to be inherited. It's so obvious that a whole field of eugenics in the United States, much more than in Britain, was based upon that statement. This comes from a eugenics book of the late 19th century from America, a family called the Kallikaks. And Kallikak is a made-up word, semi-Greek, meaning bad good. And if you look at the top there, we have a chap called Martin Kallikak, Sr. And the way the pedigrees work, I'm sure you know, the horizontal lines, the generations, the vertical lines are parent-offspring lines, and squares are males and the circles are females. And Martin Kallikak Sr. has a lawful wife, and they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 children, all of which are refreshingly N for normal, okay? But I have to tell you, it's a shocking story, that Martin Kallikak had a fling. They were not married to a nameless, feeble-minded girl. Okay, so she was F, and they had Martin Jr., who was also F, who married a lady called Rhoda Zabeth, and they didn't hang about. They had 4, 8 or 9 children: Millard, Nathan, Old Sal, Jemima, Old Moll, feeble-minded, sexually immoral, alcoholic, insane, syphilitic, criminalistic, deaf, died in infancy, TB, and so on. So clearly, what we've got here, morals, all these things are being inherited, and crime most of all. And it's it's a very surprising thing that the eugenics movement, which began in Britain and was very powerful socially, H.G. Wells was a keen eugenicist, George Bernard Shaw was a keen eugenicist, never had any practical effect. There was a marvellous speech in the House of Commons in 1913 by one of the Wedgwoods, who simply talked about the morality of doing this. But in places like the States, thousands of children were castrated because they were feeble-minded or criminal, and being feeble-minded, for example, included masturbating. You could be castrated for that. In Sweden, hundreds of children were castrated, much later than in the United States, so it had a big, big effect. So this notion of a genetic basis, not just for good behaviour, high IQ, go into Whittle Grammar School, but for bad behaviour, was really very pervasive. So what can we say about it in modern terms? Well, clearly crime is heritable. The best predictor of whether a young boy will go to prison is whether his father's been in prison. So it's heritable. Okay. That doesn't necessarily, of course, say very much at all about the genetics, but there is some hints of genetic variation behind this. This is a picture of a synapse, which is the junction between nerves. Electrical messages, electrical engineering here. Okay, electrical messages come down the nerves, and then they go into the building next door, which is chemical engineering, and they turn into chemical messages which pass from one nerve to the next. And it's a complicated process, but it involves many things, but they're called neurotransmitters. And one of the elements of the process is an enzyme called monoamine oxidase. Okay? And I won't bother you with the details, but it's very important in that role. Now, about 10 years ago, a bit more, a friend of mine called Han Brunner was in Nijmegen in Holland. He's a geneticist involved in genetic counselling, telling parents at risk of what their risks were, looking into genetic disease and the like. And he was approached out of the blue by a young lady who was saying she wanted to get married, shortly going to get married, and she wanted to have children, but she didn't want to have any sons. And if she became pregnant with a boy, could she please terminate the pregnancy? Well, I can tell you that both in Holland and here, that simple desire, what seems like a social desire, is not acceptable. And so Brunner said, no, we certainly couldn't do that. It would be regarded as completely unethical. Why are you so keen not to have a boy? And rather reluctantly, the young lady told Hans Brunner a remarkable tale. It turned out that in her family there had been quite a long history of violent disorder. Okay, and here's a pedigree which he worked out. The young lady came out with a pedigree of where these boys had caused trouble. And if you're a geneticist, if you look at that, that's a classic example of what we call sex-linked inheritance. A gene on the X chromosome, of which men have got 1 and women have got 2, and which, in other words, as much of the time is passed down through females, but shows it's passed down through mothers and shows itself in their sons. Okay, and here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 generations, and the red squares are the boys who've got into trouble. And the orange circles are their mothers, and you'll see in every one of those cases there's been a shift of 1 letter out of 3,000 million in the DNA from C to T, the ones he could actually look at. Okay, so, and that was in the monoamine oxidase gene, and what it did was to remove almost completely the activity of monoamine oxidase. And if you do that, it turns out you lack mood control. They fly off the handle at the slightest difficulty and get into violence, into terrible trouble of that kind. Now, that turned out to be really rather an exceptional case. Whoops, where are we? I'm getting confused here. However, when that came out, I was in the States at the time, in Georgia, and there was a rather sensational murder trial going on. And this was just at the time when America took a step backwards towards barbarism by bringing back the death penalty. For many years, 10, 15 years in the States, there was no death penalty. Okay. But various, particularly southern states, of course, wanted to bring it back. It had been described as cruel and unusual punishment. So to bring it back, they had to do various circuitous things to get round appeals to the Supreme Court against the death penalty. And the state of Georgia and some others actually set up a double trial system. If you'd committed some awful crime and you went through the guilt phase, found guilty or not guilty, and then after that there'd be a separate jury in the penalty phase which would decide on death penalty or no death penalty. This chap here, Stephen Mobley, I met him in prison. He looks a charming chap. He certainly isn't a charming chap. He was a guy whose pastime was robbing Domino pizza stores, and he robbed 10 or a dozen of them. And when he robbed them, he simply shot the owners. They said, give us the money. The owners would automatically give him the money, and then he just killed them. And he was picked up pretty quickly. It didn't help his particular case by the fact that when he was in prison, he had himself tattooed with the Domino pizza emblem all over his arms and would only eat pizza. But anyway, he turned up, and the evidence was overwhelming that he was guilty. Absolutely no question of it. He was guilty. Okay, so he was found guilty. Then came the second phase, the death penalty phase, and his father was the owner of a chain of shoe stores and was very rich. And his father paid a lot of money to his lawyers to try and save his son's life. Okay, and the lawyers had, just by chance, that paper from Brunner had just come out in Science, the journal Science, a week or so before. And I happened to run into one of them, and he was talking about this, and he said, what we can do is demand a genetic test on our client, Stephen Mobley, to see whether he carries this aberrant gene, which means that he wasn't in control of himself, that it wasn't him that did it, it was his DNA. And maybe we'll save his life. Well, the story goes on. It's a long, long story. There was a claim that there was a legend in the small town from which the Mobleys came, don't marry a Mobley, okay? There was then a problem because his father, from whom Stephen was supposed to have inherited this gene, was a massively successful businessman. But that doesn't matter, because if you're a nasty, unpleasant bastard for biological reasons, you will be a good businessman. So that worked well. But then the most amazing thing is that his father, who was the most extraordinarily strange character, suddenly thought one morning, while shaving, just a minute, these people are accusing me of having a gene that turns me into a psychopathic murderer. I'll sue them for libel. So he did. So he sued his son's lawyers for libel. And his son's lawyers said, the hell with it, and they left the case, and his son was then executed. Okay. But it was clearly the expectation that if you were able to show that you have a genetic heritage that changes your behavior, you should be treated in a special way. In Mobley's case, you should be treated by not being killed by the state. Okay? And I think to the nice liberal people, even in Imperial College, there must be some nice liberal people in Imperial College, that seems to us natural. And of course, in British law and in law in many countries of the world, there are things called the McNaughton rules in British law, which if you're not aware of what you're doing, you are often found either not guilty by reason of insanity, or you are treated much better than somebody who's cold-bloodedly decided to kill somebody to make money and that kind of stuff. Okay, and that seems a logical kind of argument, but it's a genetical argument, really. You're predisposed, and so we'll treat you well, a bit like the 11+. Okay, the irony is, of course, that you can use exactly the opposite argument, because when that decision was made. When that argument was made in the Mobley case, which is a very prominent case in the States, the state of Texas, next door but one, the state of Texas had a governor, I don't know what became of him, his name was George W. Bush. He signed 103 death penalty cases. He didn't let one off. He had to let one off because the guy, it was discovered he'd been in prison on the day of the supposed murder, so he couldn't have done it. And George W. Bush and his cronies changed the rule. They said that if anybody can be shown to be a continuing threat to society, then they shall be liable to the death penalty. In other words, if you say, I've got a gene that makes me violent, tough, we'll kill you like that, because you're not going to get better. Okay? Now it's a very nasty attitude, but it's a perfectly logical attitude. Okay? It's absolutely logical. It makes perfect sense, as much sense as the other one. So it's like the contrast between horse racing and the 11+. You can penalise them, or you can give them a bonus. They both make sense, and the decision on good and evil has nothing to do with science. Well, let me end up not talking about extraordinary cases like Mobley, who certainly didn't have the Dutch problem, because for Mobley, that problem has never been found anywhere else. There is, however, normal variation, like the myostatin story. There's normal variation in that monoamine oxidase gene. Some people have got very feeble monoamine oxidase. I myself have very feeble monoamine oxidase, so don't ask any difficult questions, right? Some people have very, very active monoamine oxidase. And there's a study in New Zealand, which people didn't believe, but it's actually got much better now, which shows, okay, one of the best predictors that you're going to get into trouble and violence, if you come from a very abusive home, okay, very drunken, angry kind of home, you're going to get into trouble. Now, what we've got is the rate of violent offending from 0 to 80% in kids with low monoamine oxidase activity and high monoamine oxidase activity in nice middle-class homes, in slightly mixed-up homes, and complete hellish homes. And you'll see, even for a kid with normal MAO activity in a difficult home, the levels of violence go up. His levels of violence go up to about 1 in 10. But if you come both from a difficult home and you've got weak monoamine oxidase A activity, then it shoots up to by 6 or 7 times as much. Again, nature and nurture working together. And there's a great deal of concern about what we should do about that. Should we be testing people for monoamine oxidase activity? Mine is very low, so if I beat somebody up, I'd be able to say, well, my monoamine oxidase activity is very old. Well, I'm at University College London, which is an awful environment to find yourself in, and that's my excuse, okay? Probably wouldn't work, but it makes kind of logic. Well, all this stuff was headlined as scientists discovered the gene for crime. And there was much shock and horror about this. Scientists discovered the gene for crime 50, 100, 500 years before. It's a gene that makes a substance which some of us are familiar with, this stuff here, called testosterone, okay? And of course, crime is overwhelmingly a male issue, particularly violent crime. Testosterone makes a difference in sport because male sportsmen tend to be more fitter and faster than female, but it makes a big difference in crime too. Here's the pattern of murder rate by men in red and women in blue in England and Wales to do with age. And you can see that men murder much, much more than women, okay? And it peaks, murder rate peaks as testosterone peaks at about the age of 20, 25, when they're trying to show what wonderful husbands they might make, or perhaps they're trying to destroy the opposition. There's a few grumpy old men on the right end there. But there's about a 10 times greater murder rate by males than by females. And I have no problem at all with saying that that's actually to do with testosterone, with a single gene on a single chromosome, which is the male Y chromosome. The evidence is very strong. And it's global. Here's the figures here are the figures for Detroit, and it's exactly the same. There's more grumpy old men, a 10 times difference. So you can say crime, murder is genetic. Okay, we found the gene for crime. However, look at the murder rates in Detroit, up to 1,000 murders per million people per year, compared to England and Wales, up to 25, a 40 times difference in rate. And that's environmental, because in Detroit you've got poverty, guns, gangs, drugs, frightful education system, all these things. And males are at risk of that environment because of their genes. So once again, nature and nurture are working together. So how do the courts deal with that? And once again, we have inconsistencies. Here are the patterns of sentencing for men and women for different for crimes. And without going into details, you can see if you match them, women don't do many crimes, but they do some. If you match them for crimes, men are always blamed for their genes, okay? They don't say, I'm a man, that's why I went shoplifting, okay? Let me off. They do it for matched offences, where men on the average have about a 60 or 70% longer sentence. For robbery, it's about the same. For shoplifting, they're much more likely to go to prison. For actual bodily harm, it's almost 3 times different. So males are blamed for their genetic heritage. That's the opposite of the argument that says, I'm a schizophrenic, I heard voices, let me off. So what that really tells us, I think it tells us one very important thing, which is that science can tell you everything you need to know about yourself, apart from the interesting stuff. And the other aspect, I suppose, is where are the theologians when we really need them? Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.